Okay, so let's continue on here talking about bone tissue. When we talk about bone tissue, they'll often ask you, what are the two types of bone? And the answer they're looking for is compact bone and spongy bone. If they're looking by differentiating bone by internal structure. So we have bone shapes that we can differentiate bone by: long, short, flat, irregular, sesamoid. And then we have bone types: compact and spongy bone. But when they're talking about types, they're talking about the tissue inside, its histology, or how it's put together. So most of our bones in our body actually contain both compact and spongy bone, but how much of each they have varies depending on what the bone does, where you find it, its shape. And so compact bone, when we talk about compact bone and spongy bone, you're going to hear some very broad terms surrounding them. So when we talk about compact bone, a lot of times you'll hear that compact bone is denser and stronger. And then when you talk about spongy bone, you'll talk about the fact that it is lighter weight and has more space. So we're going to kind of introduce the differences between compact and spongy bone here for a few slides. So I want to start with compact bone. So compact bone, as mentioned, it is denser and stronger of the two types of bone tissue. And you'll find it under the periosteum and in the diaphyses of long bones. So when we talk about this picture up here, this outside layer of bone is that compact bone, and then you can also find it in the shaft of the bone, this nice shaft that surrounds. Notice in the middle it's hollow. That keeps our bone lightweight, but that also serves another function, and that is to store our yellow marrow. But this outside surrounding piece is made of that really, really strong compact bone, and then that surrounding outside part of bone is made of compact bone. So the periosteum and the diaphyses. And the reason why we find it there is that it provides support and protection. So obviously in these ends, if we have this spongy bone here, we want protection in those areas. There are also areas where the bone meets other bones, so we need protection. And then in the shaft of the bone, if the inside is hollow, we want the outside to be very, very strong and durable. And so that's why you'll often find that compact bone there. Now, if we zoom in on that compact bone, it will often look like this. Now, this is a drawing because it's very difficult in this picture down at the bottom to tell what we're looking at. But we have this top diagram of compact bone, and then we have a cross section of compact bone. But you could see we have these little concentric rings. It kind of looks like it would if we had taken a tree and cut through that tree. We would get these concentric rings. And in compact bone, we get the same thing, but we get multiple. So you can see right here we have this canal here, and then surrounded by concentric rings, and then we have another one here, and here, and here, and here, and same thing up here in the diagram. So when we look under a microscope at compact bone, the smallest structural unit we can see is what we call an osteon. And osteons are also known as Haversian systems. And what an osteon or a Haversian system is this one set of concentric rings that all connect and work together. So you could see all of these rings kind of center around this central canal. That's one osteon. And these rings center around this one. That's another osteon. So you have tons of osteons that make up even just a small section of compact bone. Okay, so an osteon is made of concentric rings, and those concentric rings, all they are is calcified matrix. So you can see in this picture we have this little structure here and here where we have these blobs. Those are our osteocytes that have gotten stuck in the matrix, and then the surrounding stuff is matrix. So we have osteocytes and matrix. So these concentric rings of matrix, if you have one ring, it's called a lamella, Lamella, a lamella. But if you have multiple rings, which in this case we do, lots and lots of multiple rings, those are called lamellae. So you'll see that over here, interstitial lamellae because there are multiple concentric rings, okay? And then down the center of each osteon, we have this canal. And the canal contains blood vessels, nerves, lymphatic vessels. You could see the three colors showing that we have those several different things: a blood vessel, a lymphatic vessel, a nerve. And that central canal is called either a central canal or a Haversian canal. And you can notice that as these vessels and nerves and such come up the center of our Haversian or central canal, that they branch off and they go in directions that are perpendicular to our Haversian canal. And these vessels that branch off and go at these right angles are known as perforating or Volkmann's canals. So you can see as it branches off at this right angle, this would be a perforating or a Volkmann's canal. Okay, so you could see that here labeled perforating canal as it goes at a right angle to our Haversian canal. Okay, so Haversian canals are also known as central canals because they're central. And then our perforating canals are also known as Volkmann's canals. Okay. Osteocytes. We mentioned this previously, but our little osteocytes sit in what we call lacunae or lacuna. A lacuna is singular, and then lacunae, Lacuna, and then we add an E to make it plural, lacuna or lacunae. And these are the sites where we find our osteocytes, and they're found at the borders of adjacent lamellae. So our canaliculi connect with the canaliculi of others, and then we eventually connect with the central canal, and this is how we get our nutrients from that central or Haversian canal all the way out to our osteocytes. So if you look at this picture closely here, we have our central or Haversian canal, and then we have these osteocytes that sit within the lacunae. And the lacunae have these, and you can't see it super great, but there's these tiny branches of canaliculi that connect one lamellae to the next, and then to the next, all the way to the central canal. And these canaliculi allow our osteocytes to get nutrients and then to get rid of waste products. Okay, so that canaliculi is really important in allowing us to be able to remove waste as well as receive nutrients to our osteocytes. Okay, so just another review here. Compact bone is also known as dense bone because there's not a lot of space between the solid components. If we go back to our picture here, everything is very, very tightly packed, and you can see that in the real picture as well as the diagram. But spongy bone itself is also known as trabecular bone, which we'll talk about what trabeculae is, but it's this irregular network. And instead of having this dense matrix, we have thin plates of matrix or bone, and it has a lot of space between these plates, and those spaces are called trabeculae or spicules. And those spaces are important because they allow us to put our red bone marrow in. So spongy bone has all these gaps where we stick in red bone marrow, which is responsible for creating blood cells. So if we look at a review picture here, once again, this is compact bone. We have our osteon here, Haversian canal, perforating or Volkmann's canal here, and then this zooms in, so this helps us a lot. We have our osteocyte sitting within lacuna, and then these little canaliculi that connect one lamella to the next, to the next. So I like this picture because it shows you the canaliculi connecting from one to the next all the way to this Haversian canal. Okay, then if we talk about spongy bone, notice that you can kind of see some similarity, but then when you zoom out, look at all the space provided here, here, here between the plates of bone. All these spaces, the white, is where you would find red marrow, whereas if you look at compact bone, there's no space. So you can see this bone is compact here, kind of branching into spongy. Look at all the space you have in the spongy bone here that you don't in compact bone over here. So, spongy bone. Spongy bone will also be called cancellous bone. So if you hear cancellous, just another word for spongy bone. But it contains osteocytes in lacuna, just as does our compact bone, but they're not arranged in those concentric circles like we see with compact bone. Instead, the lacuna and osteocytes are found in, it kind of looks more like lace or like a lattice network of matrix spikes. So these little spikes here, we will call these trabeculae. And the trabeculae, they're kind of laid down in these random networks of these little spicules and trabeculae. And each trabeculae forms along lines of stress. So it kind of looks random, but if there's stress placed on a bone at this site, that's why we will have trabeculae or spicules. And if there's not a huge amount of stress, then we allow that gap to still be there. And the spaces of the trabeculae provide a balance to our dense, heavy, compact bone, keeps our bone a little bit more lightweight so that our muscles can actually move our bones. If our whole bones were made of compact bone and we didn't have that hollow center where our yellow marrow is, and we didn't have the ends where our spongy bone is found, they'd be really heavy. And so the spongy bone helps our bones stay light so muscles can actually create movement. The spaces of our spongy bone also, as mentioned, contains that red marrow. And the cool thing about putting red marrow in these spaces is that then the trabeculae, not only is it found on areas of stress, but the fact that the trabeculae is there protects that red marrow as it creates blood cells, sorry. So this bone creates a protection area for us creating blood cells and allows for hematopoiesis to occur. So you can see that the cells look a lot different when we're looking at spongy bone because we get these lacuna. The lacuna, notice that's where our osteocyte sits. We still have canaliculi reaching out to be able to get nutrients. And then on the edge, we'll find our osteoclast where it's constantly repairing and rebuilding new cells. Okay. So when we talk about spongy bone, you could see that it has a lot less dense network of matrix and allows for us to put a lot lightweight there. So let's talk just really quickly about the blood and nerve supply of bone. So spongy bone and the medullary cavity receive their nourishment from arteries that pass through compact bone. And these arteries enter through what we call a nutrient foramen, which you can see here. And foramen is just another word for a hole, circular hole in the bone that allows a blood vessel to pass through. So this nutrient foramen or small opening is found in the diaphysis. Notice that this is our compact bone, so it comes through this diaphysis or shaft through the compact bone, and it penetrates into our bone and allows those vessels to get to all parts of our bone. So the osteocytes in spongy bone are nourished by blood vessels up here. If you look clear up here at the top, the periosteum, which is the protective layer of bone, also allows, if you look here, we've got blood vessels coming in, and they can nourish the spongy bone at the top. And then in the middle, we get blood vessels entering our nutrient foramen here. And as blood passes through the marrow cavities, it is collected by veins, and then it can take that blood out and refresh it with new nutrients and then return new fresh nutrients to the bone. And so when we talk about arteries entering through the nutrient foramen in the diaphysis, we also want to mention that they enter up here at the top too. And then when we talk about blood vessels and nerves, nerves, you have to remember they follow the same pathways as blood vessels. And so nerves are responsible. We know that a lot of them will sense pain. And it also appears that nerves can help play a role with bone in regulating blood supply and bone growth. And so you will see nerve tissue in areas that bone is still growing or where bone is maybe been damaged, because those nerve tissues and those nerves that are found surrounding bone and at bone sites, they can help us sense that pain if we get a break in the bone, but they can also send messages to the brain that can help us figure out if we need more blood supply, less blood supply, as well as what needs to be done to repair bone. So we'll have nerve and blood vessels perforate here as well as up here in the spongy bone regions of our body. Okay, so let's talk really quickly about the anatomy of bone. So we want to talk about anatomy of bone in two ways. First, we're going to talk about the anatomy of a long bone, and then we'll talk about the anatomy of flat bones. So when we talk about a long bone, I put this picture up here because it really will help us kind of differentiate everything. So a bone has two main parts, and the first one is right here, diaphysis, and the second one is up here, epiphysis, and down here, epiphysis. So when we talk about diaphysis, we're talking about the shaft portion of the bone, which you can see labeled out here. So diaphysis is the shaft of the bone, and it runs between the two epiphyses. So you can see here we've got a proximal epiphysis and a distal epiphysis, okay? And epiphysis refers to the end. And you'll see here on our drawing we have what we call a metaphysis. They won't usually ask you as many questions about the metaphysis because it's just the area where we're not quite sure if it's the end or the shaft. And so they use metaphysis as that space kind of in between the end and the shaft. So we have epiphyses, which are the ends, and then diaphysis, which is the shaft of the long bone. Then if we look inside a bone, notice that this area inside the shaft is actually hollow. So this hollow area is known as the medullary cavity. Okay, cavity, medullary cavity. And it is actually filled, as is shown right here, with yellow marrow. And yellow marrow helps us store fat, or in other words, store energy in our bones. And then the walls of our diaphysis, as we mentioned previously, are made of compact bone. Okay. Then as our bones reach the epiphyses, they widen out and we get these nice epiphyseal section. And the epiphysis, notice, they're made of or filled with spongy bone and red marrow because red marrow fills the spaces of spongy bone. And then the epiphysis, we already mentioned, meets the diaphysis at what we call the metaphysis, which is that area in between. The metaphysis, something to kind of know about the metaphysis, you know if you're in that area because that is where you'll find what we call the growth plate or the epiphyseal plate or the epiphyseal line. So this is that area of bone that you will often see, and it gets smaller and smaller as you grow, but in younger growing kids, this area is really well defined under x-ray and it's really, really easy to see. And the epiphyseal plate, what it is it's actually a layer of cartilage. So it's see-through, and that's why it shows up in your x-ray because it's not this dense bone, so it just shows up as nothing on an x-ray. But it's actually a layer of cartilage, and it is an area that allows for us to still have bone growth. And then when bone growth stops as you become early adults, a lot of times that's in your 18 to 21 years, so a lot of you guys are still growing, but some are getting close. This cartilage gets replaced by bone tissue, and then this becomes just a line. So when you're growing, this is cartilage, and then when you're done growing, this just becomes a line of bone tissue. Okay? All right, so if we come back here to our medullary cavity, the medullary cavity has inside a lining, it's a protective lining, and it's known as endosteum. Okay? And this endosteum lining is where bone growth, repair, and remodeling can occur. So this inside endosteum lining is where we'll often see changes to the bone. The outer surface of the bone is covered by a protective layer or covering, and you can see it's pulled back, this protective layer right here, and it's called periosteum. Periosteum contains our blood vessels, our nerves, our lymphatic vessels, and all of these things will perforate into the bone through the periosteum and nourish the bone. So periosteum will allow the nerves in right here through the nutrient foramen, and then as well up here in the epiphyses. Okay, so periosteum. Then another thing about periosteum is that this is often the site where we will find tendons and ligaments attached. So if we have, for example, this is our femur, and our quadriceps are going to come up and attach up here. When those muscles and tendons attach, they're going to attach the periosteum. And then down here we would have our knee joint, so you would end up having things such as your lateral ligament. So your LCL would be here, your MCL would be here, your ACL and PCL would be here. They connect to that periosteum layer of the bone. And periosteum covers the whole outer surface except for one place, and that is where the epiphyses meet other bones to form joints. So you could see down here, periosteum kind of ends, and we end up with this site with just articular cartilage. And that is just a thin layer of cartilage that helps reduce friction so we're not wearing down the periosteum or the bone itself. And cartilage is just better at absorbing shock and weight than just bone tissue. So that cartilage helps withstand shock or friction that we get over time as bones meet each other, like they would here, where our femur would meet our tibia. Okay. Now, if we move from there, so just as a quick review of some of the terminology, we have articular cartilage where bone would meet or articulate with another bone. We have our epiphyses or our ends. Then we have our diaphysis or shaft, the hollow medullary cavity, which is lined by endosteum. Our entire bone is protected by a protective layer of periosteum. Inside our medullary or hollow cavity of our shaft, we have yellow marrow, which stores energy. And then in our epiphyses, we have spongy bone that is filled with that red marrow where we make blood cells. And then the diaphysis is surrounded by compact bone. Okay, so just another picture showing you the exact same thing. And then this picture up here on the right is an actual bone cut open. Okay, so femur is this one, and then the humerus is this drawing here on the left. This one shows you how the vessels perforate up in the areas of spongy bone. So notice that we have vessels perforating through the periosteum in our spongy bone areas to give them lots and lots of nutrients, because in this area is a lot of times, as you'll see, the epiphyseal line where we have bone growth growing on. And then you could see the nutrient foramen where those blood vessels get in and nourish the bone from there. Now, if we switch over to this slide, you could see what I talked about on the x-ray, how an epiphyseal plate, this one is not yet closed. We can see that area that's cartilaginous that's allowing the bone to still grow. And if you zoom in on that under a microscope, you could see that we have this dense area of bone tissue, and then you start to get this area where you have cartilage that's getting hard, turning into osteocytes, bone tissue. And then you have lots and lots of cartilaginous area here where it's down here and still growing. Whereas up here, it's bone tissue. So this cartilaginous area would be the area we see that is not filled in with bone here. Okay, let's talk about flat bones just really, really quickly. Flat bones, like if we talk about the skull bones, since that's the picture we've got here, these consist of a layer of what we call spongy bone right here. And diplo is often what you'll hear it called, but it's just this layer of spongy bone. And then that layer of spongy bone is sandwiched on either side with compact bone. And so the two layers of compact bone and then the inner spongy bone work together, and they often are going to protect our internal organs. So if the outer layer of cranial bone fractures, then you still have this inner spongy bone and the inner compact bone layer to protect. So that 3-layer system really helps to protect our inside organs, and that's why we have a different structure to our flat bones, whereas our long bones don't have that exact same structure if we look at them. Okay, so finishing up there, the next section that we're going to talk about is bone markings, and we'll pause here so that you can go to a different video to talk about bone markings.